to everyone. Good morning. My name is Darko Kot. I am from Slovenia and work for ZAK. ZAK is the Slovenian National Building and Civil Engineering Institute. I'm also the AM4INFRA project team member. Thank you all for joining this webinar. This is the second webinar following the project Living Labs. Well, since we already took a lot of time because of these problems with the connections, just a short information about the project explained in few lines. AM4INFRA is a coordination and support action. The objective is to deliver life cycle and risk-based asset management framework approach. This approach will enable consistent and coherent cross-asset, cross-model and cross-border decision-making on European infrastructure networks. You will hear more about this project from the following presenter. Wole, can you go one slide further? So the key principle of the project is learning by doing, and for this reason the project is not only providing a framework and some tools and guidelines for asset management, but also demonstrates them in practice. This occurs in 3 so-called living laboratories that provide an environment against the backdrop of practical situations on the mostly on 10T network. So we have 3 living labs: the Rome Ring Road, the M4 M25 junction near London, and the E35 section between Antwerp, Eindhoven, and Venlo. So today in this webinar, we will present you the results of this last one, or actually it's the second one, Living Lab E34 Eindhoven. When we start, just some few practical advices. Next slide. So when you logged in to the webinar, there was a GoToMeeting pop-up window that popped up your desktop. You all have muted your microphones, so that's done. This is just for practical reason, because some background noise may influence the host. You will have the opportunity to ask some questions towards the end of the webinar. But in any case, you have also possibility to make these questions during the presentations. But I suggest that you use the chat function, which is available in this pop-up window at the bottom. You can write down a question there, and at the appropriate time, these questions will be read out and answers. Just for information, Wole, do you record this this webinar? The webinar is being.
Yes, it is recorded. Yes.
Okay, is being recorded, and the link will be forwarded to you all after the webinar in a few days. So for the agenda, Wole, next slide, please. The agenda, we will start with the general overview of the project. This will be presented by Ramesh Singhal. Then next item is guideline for the use of the framework architecture, presented by Aryan Hijra. Then this will be followed by the presentation of the context and scope of the Living Lab, and further on with the outcome of the Living Lab. Afterwards, there is some slot of time reserved for discussion and summary and next text. So that's the agenda for today, and I'm giving floor now to the first presenter, Ramesh Singhal, who will explain more about the project. Ramesh, are you there?
Hi, Darko. Ramesh isn't here, so I'll just cover for him.
Okay, very good. Please start, Nang.
Sure. So the AM4INFRA project, which is stands for Asset Management for Infrastructure, is a transport network. Is really based around the TEN-T network, so the Trans-European network. This network secures connectivity between different countries and different parts of the country via ports and airports. The outcome of the AM4INFRA project is really to achieve a well-integrated, optimal performing transport infrastructure network in Europe, which is also a key element of the white paper. The AM4INFRA project is worked on by 5 national infrastructure agencies. These are Italy with ANAS, the UK with House of England, Rijkswaterstaat from the Netherlands, ZAG for Slovenia, and TII for Ireland. So what this is gives opportunity for the 3 modes of transport, road, rail, and waterborne, to come together and define, as Darko said, a life cycle and risk-based framework architecture for Europe. This will be adapted across the TEN-T corridors by means of the Living Lab approach, which is what we are going to be discussing today. So in this, for the AM4INFRA, we have three main work packages, where we're looking at having a common language, which is being led by ANAS in Italy. We're looking at having a common approach, which is led by the Netherlands, Rijkswaterstaat, and then we're looking at having a common life cycle management and risk-based approach. The aim of these deliverables is to help policymakers and managers of transport infrastructure to take on the challenge of managing and optimizing their networks successfully. That's the end.
Okay, thank you, Nang. Now, for the next point, we will go to the guideline for the use of framework architecture, which is going to be presented by Aryan Haidara. Aryan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Darko. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Is my voice okay?
At least me, I hear.
Okay, excellent. Can I get the first slide, please? Yeah, as said, the Living Lab in Eindhoven is one of the 3 living labs, and it takes the first work package, the common approach from the AM4INFRA project, as a centerpiece. And this one was being tested in the Eindhoven Living Lab. From this common approach, one of the elements playing out here is cross-border optimization. That's why this is a living lab, a joint living lab between the Flanders Road Agency and Rijkswaterstaat, the Dutch road agency. So that was the setup of this living lab. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, you can take the next one. Yeah, so the first work package, the common approach is focusing on finding the shared elements all agencies use. So it's not about developing a mandatory framework all agencies are supposed to be using somewhere in the future. That is not what it is. It is finding those common elements which we all share, which could help us in optimizing over the, crossing borders, crossing modalities, and understanding each other what we are doing. So that was also the purpose of this Living Lab. So in more in practical terms, the question was, so how can we optimize transport corridors on the basis of smart lifecycle management and cross-asset, cross-border, and cross-modal optimization? So that's quite an ambition. But as said, this requires mutual understanding of infrastructure agencies, and that prompts the question, what is the common language we all share? First task was finding the asset management elements which are embedded in all asset management structures by the different agencies participating in this project. Next slide, please. And the next slide will show an umbrella approach. Wally, can you shift to the next one? Oh, that's, yeah. One forward. The next, yeah, that's the one. Of course, this Horizon 2020 project, this AM4INFRA project, is not something that started completely new. There's been done a lot of work in previous task forces and task groups. For instance, in the CEDAR working group on asset management, the N2. This was a cooperation between a large group of European countries, also with a similar aim, trying to find the common language and the elements we all share. So that has been used as a background. And the elements that came up have been extensively discussed in the AM4INFRA group. So what elements do we take as building stones for this common language? And these were also reflected on the wider asset management approaches as shown and provided by the Asset Management Council, by the European Federation of National Maintenance Societies, and by the Global Forum on Maintenance and Asset Management. These elements have also been reflected on the asset management programs by other agencies, for instance, Network Rail in the UK, to see if the approach we take here is not typically road-based, but also works for other infrastructure providers. So this was all taken together. This brings us to the next slide. And you can keep it like this. The next slide shows the elements that we all share, and as you can imagine, each country has its own institutional context. So this is not about aligning all institutional contexts, but all these what we all share is that we work from phases, from a needs phase to solutions phase to delivering phase, even if institutional settings are very different. Please, next click, please, Wally. And it all starts, whatever we do on infrastructure, with internal, external pressures and demands. So there is a reason these agencies start acting. It can be a service related to service and intervention levels. Can be about improving resilience, sustainability, or changing policy regulations, or it's just straightforward identified network shortcomings. That means something has to be done. This means the infrastructure agency responsible will have to make a decision responding to those pressures and demands. One of the building blocks we commonly found is that this all relates to an agreed service level. So that is something many of the agencies have in common. Next step, please. Well, if those shortcomings are noticed or action or urgencies are pressing, something has to be done, but the question is what kind of solutions could adequately solve the problems. And what all agencies agreed upon is that there's a certain way you can divide this, because sometimes you can just easily solve things by responding within the existing networks. So you can think about just regular operation and maintenance works, or if bigger problems might occur or urgencies, then it requires improvement of the existing network. So that takes some more investment and preparation. Sometimes even within the network, the demands cannot be solved. Then the response would be a completely new infrastructure. This could be a new roads or maybe some other type of infrastructure. And at other times, and quite often this is more at the policy level, you can think of policy options. For instance, licenses for trucks to drive or not in the weekends, or having toll routes or something like that. So these are not physical actions, but more policy actions influencing the flow of users on those networks, or perhaps otherwise. So that's the solution phase. Then we come to the delivery phase. Next click, please. Oh, forgot to mention, in the solutions phase, the commonality in building blocks all agencies share is this is commonly done by the use of deterministic and risk-based tools, and whole life cost calculation methods. Much more will be told about this in the next living lab, because this is these are the elements that were central in Work Package 2, as led by Highways England, and where the next living lab in London will be about. Then we come to the delivery phase. As said, in delivery, response within existing networks, that's often operation and maintenance. You could also think about the upgrade and improvement elements. But if problems are growing too big and it cannot be solved within the current infrastructure networks, then new networks or new elements or corridors have to be built. That can be roads if it's if that's the most if that's the decided solution. But sometimes it's just you have to facilitate the traffic flow in maybe rail transport or waterborne transport, or even by air. So there are a variety of ways that have to be that can solve those problems, and those have to be weighed. Next click, please. A common building block found here was the route-based renewal and maintenance, because it's often not done just on a singular element, but you build this in programs. Then there were two overall covering building blocks. Everything needs detailed knowledge of the assets, and as said, you need to have the appropriate governance and processes, and that will be specific for each country. Next step, please. Once delivered, the whole circus starts again by evaluating what's going on, and are there any new pressures or new shortcomings. So this was perhaps a bit abstract, but on the basis of all literature, scans, discussions by the variety of agencies, these were elements everybody recognized, and these were elements which felt as good elements where discussions could be based on. Of course, if you go deeper, then you have, for instance, as in Work Package 2, life cycle optimizations, then it gets more concrete. But this could be seen as an overarching architecture for infrastructure agencies responsible for managing specific networks. Next slide, please. This is in short what I wanted to share in this webinar. I hope this was all clear. But this was the short overview of the framework architecture and the elements which are used as a kind of building blocks for the conversation and dialogue to optimize the networks, crossing borders, crossing modalities, and together to shift towards a more European optimized network. Thank you. Back to you, Darko, I think.
Okay, thank you, Arjan. Thank you very much for this presentation. Before we go to your next presentation about the outcomes of the Living Lab, first we have another presentation, is the context of the Living Lab, which will be presented by Ruth Smith. Wole, I think it's 2 more slides. And next one. Okay, Ruth?
Ruth had some trouble. This is Arjan speaking again. Ruud had a lot of trouble with logging in, and the app didn't work. So I'm not sure whether he's able to join us now.
Okay, but Arjan, I suppose that you can take over this context as well.
I'll be glad to, but I'm not sure whether I will be able to do it as thoroughly and with the same background as Ruud did. But I'll try my best.
Okay, Wole, next slide, please.
So, as a bit of an introduction, doing a living is learning by doing. And learning by doing, well, you need to have something in hand to talk about. Otherwise, you're just talking in the air, so to speak. The focus of the Living Lab in Eindhoven was about the E34, and that is a route corridor between Antwerp and Düsseldorf, so past Eindhoven. That's why the name Eindhoven pops up. But it plays out in a much wider context. Ruud had mentioned the number, as far as I believe it is about the setting is just within one of the biggest entry points for cargo flow, transport flows into Europe. You see the big blue line that represents all shipping coming from all over the world, trying to find one of the big ports in northwestern Europe. I believe Ruud mentioned about 4,000 to 4,500 ships a day with cargo pass by on these routes and call at one of those ports. So you can imagine this area is quite significant or important for the wider Europe, particularly for transport flows. And the corridor we're talking about is just in the middle of it. Can I, next slide? Also from the European Commission, they also look at the entire infrastructure network in Europe, and they defined a set of corridors which are vital for well-functioning networks in wider Europe. I believe 3 out of 7 of those main corridors cross the area with a green line around it. So again, from the land-based infrastructure, you see this is a very important part of the European network, and the context we are taking for this Living Lab is right in the middle of it. Quite often you see, I'm not sure whether, are there any more slides on this? Is there a next slide? Oh, and how I see it. This is the representation of the road network and the railroad network you just saw a few moments ago. So all those networks become more dense in the region of the Netherlands and Belgium. And these are the 10T corridors I mentioned, and as you can see, they spread out much wider in Europe, but in the area in Belgium and the Netherlands, it's quite dense. So there are very big traffic going there. specifically for the corridor we're talking about from Antwerp to Eindhoven to Düsseldorf, sea level cargo coming from the Antwerp port, crossing the border from Belgium to the Netherlands, and then going to deeper into Germany. That means quite often you see trucks on the right, just completely, not a traffic jam, but a completely flow of only trucks, and passenger cars don't find the opportunity to find the right lane at all. So on this entire corridor, they often tend to drive for most of the part on the left lane, because the right lane is completely occupied by trucks. So that is something that is particularly playing out on this road. Is there a next slide? Here you see it. So here you see the route coming from Belgium, Flanders, over Antwerp, the port of Zeebrugge, Zeebrugge, at the western side, and then all the way crossing the border to the Netherlands, passing by Eindhoven, and then to Burg in Germany, where to be the largest inland waterway ports of Europe. There is, you see a deer jumping on the border of Belgium and Netherlands. There's an ecoduct, so there's also there's also attention for the ecological quality of this corridor, passing a variety of natural parks. And close to Eindhoven, you see an airport, just like close to Antwerp. One of the issues playing out there is that the regional airport of Eindhoven is growing rapidly, and that represents many other situations in Europe where you see these regional airports growing on the basis of the low-cost carriers, but these are often not so well connected, and this also causes all kinds of troubles in the connectability to the wider network. I think that's in a nutshell a bit of the context that plays out here. Mostly it's about dense traffic flows, cargo flows from the main ports to the hinterland, and crossing two borders in a short stretch. So I think that's quite in a nutshell the things we'd like to share about the context.
Okay, thanks, Arjan. So you were so good. So you that it's already the time for your next presentation. So Arjan will proceed with this outcome of the Living Lab Eindhoven that was held last week, a week ago. Please.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, sort of feels like getting a bit a one-man show now, but well, I'm happy to do this, and I'm glad we are able to share all the things we did and for a wider audience. So next slide, please. So this presentation is about what we actually did in the Living Lab. So I'll guide you through the process, the steps we took that day, and then I come to the more specific conclusions for this Living Lab. So what is on this corridor, the E34, and then I have a set of conclusions more in a wider sense. What does this mean for corridor operations, crossing borders in general European context? So first, the steps we took in this Living Lab. One-day event from 10 o'clock in the morning up to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. We had about 35 people in this Living Lab. Most of the people came from either Rijkswaterstaat, the Dutch road agency, or AWV, the Flemish road agency. But also we had attendees from the bigger cities close located to this corridor, and also somebody representing a railroad agency. They started with the work of AM4INFRA, followed by an explanation of the decision making all the way from minister to operation at the Waterstaat site, followed by the presentation, a similar presentation by how this is done in Flanders. That's quite interesting because you get back-to-back two presentations of decision making about road agencies playing out in different countries. So immediately see that similar things are being decided about, but the way it is structured shows many differences. So that also shows that it can be a bit troublesome to find the right person or the right element or the right department if things border optimization is needed. Next slide, please. After that, it was not a day of only presentations, but also, of course, it's a living lab. Work had to be done. So the idea was to break sessions on specific, very concrete topics where we both felt cross-border optimization should be in place or could be in place. So these breakout sessions, here we have the 8 titles. One was about maintenance and operation, following the framework architecture as presented earlier. Second one was infrastructure renewal and upgrade. There's a lot of stuff going on around parking lots for trucks. Traffic flow projections in the future. So what do we expect on both sides of the borders? Cross-modal plans. Do we see opportunities or threats coming from other modalities? Traffic management in general. Then the data and cybersecurity part, and sustainability was also one of the talking points. Well, we did this in 2 rounds, and for each element we had small groups of 4 to sometimes 6 people discussing this on the basis of internal documents we shared and which could be used in these discussions. At the end of this, short presentations were done to reflect on this. So the conclusions were shared. The discussions were not set up to come to specific conclusions for the different topics. The idea was to see, to find a way of working together. So it's more like finding and recognizing the institutional approaches from both sides to see whether there's ground for further cooperation and how this should be arranged. In the next phase, perhaps the more specialists on the specific topics should be there, but this was now just trying out and finding our ways. Then the slide doesn't mention there was also a little bit of an intermezzo of the maturity analysis for both organizations on asset management. Both organizations, the Flanders Road Administration and the Dutch Road Administration, did a maturity check on asset management, similar tool they used. So it was quite interesting to see those conclusions, those results compared, although the method is not entirely meant to compare different organizations, but at least this gives good elements for discussion where you see differences between those organizations. And it was concluded by a discussion panel of the leadership from both organizations and questions from the audience. So this was a bit the setup of the day. That brings me to the conclusions. Can I get the next slide, please? As we kind of expected from this living lab, we thought perhaps we would get reflections on, well, you don't need to coordinate over the border for all the issues. So perhaps some of the issues should ask for some cross-border coordination, but sometimes that's also taking resources. But what came forward was that there was a high demand on cross-border alignment of things. So the discussions were very vivid. It was also concluded that this was for first living lab, but now there should come a short list of the most urgent issues playing out. For instance, what came up was that the future functionality of the different stretches should be aligned, so we know then where investments, whether they are aligned with the investments on the other side of the border. For instance, if you have a bridge crossing the highway, well, it would be nice if on both sides of the border, bridges crossing the highway leave room for a similar number of lanes. Third point is get cross-border acquainted. Everything starts with knowing the people on the other side. There was also a lot of support to do some kind of opportunity mapping. So go sit together and take the corridor as a basis and see what opportunities pop up. And then last but not least, even though on both sides of the border the language used is Dutch, still you see the terminology is quite different on both sides of the language, and sometimes words in the Dutch language mean something different on one side of the border compared to the other one. So it's quite easy to get in confusing situations or not understanding the other party. So this in a nutshell were the conclusions for the specific corridor. Then next slide, please. What also came up is that all participants noticed this was a very nice opportunity to address all kind of things playing out, and finally they found an audience, the right audience to talk about this. So there were a lot of elements where it was felt this cross-border optimization were needed, and these were quite kind of general topics which we expect to play out at other border crossings as well. What we also found out, if we reflect this on the framework architecture as presented earlier, is that the cross-border issues quite often you suppose they link to a single element of that framework, but before you know, you see it links to a variety of elements in the decision-making process, the phases you go through, from needs phase to solution phase to delivery phase, but also linking to other modalities and so on. So quite often, if you start a conversation, you think it's quite a well-scoped topic, but going a bit deeper into it, you see links to all kind of other elements. And the third point is cross-border issues easily propagate deep into national networks. It's a bit similar as the previous point. You think you're talking about something that plays out around the border, but going deeper into it, you see the effects and issues run deep into the national networks. For instance, there was this topic about the truck parking. There are many trucks being parked in the weekends along the corridor, both in Belgium and in the Netherlands. That's also linked to the, as it's not allowed to drive in Germany in the weekend for those trucks. But as soon as you start managing, if there's not enough space in Belgium, then you see an overflow of trucks coming to the Netherlands and seeking parking places in the villages around the road. And what also happened, for instance, which was not seen beforehand, is that when ports are protected and secured more to prevent illegal immigration by people, you see immigrants trying to get into trucks earlier on the road. So that shifts deeper or more eastwards to Belgium, and as soon as they manage the problem there, you could expect this to play out in the Netherlands as well. So these kind of issues are interconnected issues. not always on the plate of the road agency, but it brings a lot of other issues as well. So it's more than just elements playing out just around the border. Then the fourth point is the institutional asymmetry. As both organizations have different mandates, different responsibilities, you see it's not always easy to find the right person on the other side to discuss a certain problem, and sometimes you need more than one organization on the other side as a counterpart to discuss problems on behalf of your own organization. So there's a big asymmetry, and it takes quite some time to understand the organization of at the other side of the border. And having said that, this brings quite a few people to the table to solve problems, so that can be quite complex. One of the recommendations made was that we have to try to think more in terms of interests of different stakeholders and adding value at both sides of the border. Also, the value chain was mentioned here. Next slide, please. Oh, my computer. So that was a little bit of wrap up of the Living Lab. Here you see all the participants attending the Living Lab. So far it was felt that it energized the people. They were very interested and happy to talk to their counterparts on the other side, not only to solve problems, but also to learn how similar problems are tackled on the other side of the border. So that was a kind of a dual learning element in it. It is to be continued. That was the strong feeling of all the participants and the leadership. So next Living Labs are being planned. And these will evolve around a new set of topics where most urgency is felt, and then inviting with specific experts on these different topics. That's in a nutshell the summary of the Living Lab of Eindhoven, Darko.
Okay, Arjen, thank you very much. Very good. This is about our presentations for, or let's say for the presentation part for today. As of course you have noticed that we had some problems. I have to apologize again. We experienced some problems with the application for the webinar. Now we all know that after a weekend the most critical are the first 5 days, and Thursday is among them. So let's start the discussion part. Are there any questions for presenters? We had not only Arjen, we had also Neng as a presenter. Is there anything that you would like to know more? Any issue that we would like to be more discussed? If you're not able to use your mic, then you can also use that chat part of the GoToMeeting pop-up window to put a question. Arjen, you said that, well, you have discussed a number of issues, cross-border or whatever it is, or infrastructure issues, and you mentioned that for example, that already the language is important, knowing that well, participants were speaking, let's say, Belgian, Dutch, Flemish, but you experienced the differences between these two languages, resulting in some important differences in understanding understanding different elements of even of asset management. is there any lesson learned on this too in such cases? Now I'm thinking about the cross-border participation or communication, where it's more usual would be that people speak different languages, and then that they from the terminology part they use different terms. Do you see a need for some pre-event communications or preparations before going on an event like this, like a living lab, where you would supposedly discuss on many items?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. It a little bit did surprise us, the troubles we found even speaking the same language, but on the reflection it falls apart in two big elements. First is the terminology used. Quite often you use similar words, for instance renovation or replacement or maintenance and operation, and so that's the terminology part, and you kind of expect or assume that the counterpart has the same kind of activities under those terms. That was a misunderstanding. So you have to be very keen on the terminology and just discuss this and tell each other, don't assume you know, because it's different, and because in your internal language you use this terminology so often, you kind of have this fixed definition attached to it. So that's the first one. The second one, talking about the actual language, because we speak Dutch on both sides of the border, I think that's perhaps a disadvantage, because you kind of assume again that you mean the same things. And if you speak, for instance, German and French on both sides of the borders, you are very keen on trying to find out what something means if it's said by the other one. And here you kind of just expect again that it's a similar meaning as it has on your own side of the border. Although I can also imagine if you try to do cross-border optimization from Italy to France or Portugal to Spain, language can be a big barrier. So it takes time and it takes effort, and perhaps, as you mentioned, Darko, a good preparation to get through this. So yes, it's certainly something to be aware of.
Okay, thank you. There's a question posed by Warren Bradley. Well, was there any discussion on the systems that are used? For example, system used that could share experience and data, such as asset management, deterioration, projections, or systems for plan and work?
Oh, yeah, that would be very appropriate thing to do. But this is more one of the focus points of the Living Lab in Rome and the Living Lab in London. In this Living Lab, it was trying to get reflections on the general framework architecture from kind of overarching view, where big elements play out like cross-modal optimization and all kind of things on cross-border issues that propagate into those networks. So this was not a specific element discussed here. Also the audience we asked for this Living Lab was more focused on trying to show and compare the decision of lines of sight, the decision-making tree in both organizations, not so much on specific methodologies on asset management deeper into the organization. But indeed, it is a focus point of the consortium, the AM4INFRA consortium, and it gets a lot of attention in work package 2 and 3 related to Living Lab Rome and Living Lab in London. So I'm sorry, it's not really an answer to the question. It was not so much in discussion here. I hope this was a question from Warren, I believe. So I hope this is okay like this.
Maybe an invitation for the next webinars as well. Okay, next question is by Geraldine Walsh. Arjan, there were a number of conclusions presented, all of which seem very relevant. In terms of the next living labs, what specifically do you consider important to address next? Was there, for example, one or two key conclusions that were perceived to be of greater relevance?
Yeah. Great question. There were actually two elements. I should have underscored those. It was really felt where it was very urgent and important to find this cross-border dialogue because it's difficult to continue otherwise. And that was about the future expected functionality of the network. At both sides, we had aging infrastructure, for instance, bridges over the highway, and at both sides, the organizations are considering what to do with it, and that asks for, so what is it you think you need in the future, and that is certainly something that has to be discussed with your counterpart on the other side of the border. So the future functionality of the corridor, that was felt as one of the most important issues. So that's more, well, let's say, technical part. The second major conclusion of the day was everything starts and ends with knowing the people on the other side. And that was specifically felt very strongly by the leadership, as you saw a lot of new connections started that day. Most of the people from both sides of the border didn't know each other. And whatever you want to discuss and whatever you want to optimize, it starts with knowing the people on the other side and having a feeling you can call them any time of the day or something like that and get acquainted. And for that reason, you also need to have these kind of events, not only to discuss technical issues, but also to have a conversation, get to know the people behind these elements. So I think that if I should have to pick two most important conclusions, I think these are the two. Would that be answer to your question, Geraldine? Well, if I'm not seeing any responses yet, but
yeah, Geraldine says that yes. So you answered her. There's another question from Fabio Pasquali. It's again about language. To which extent the participants to the Living Club had a common basis of asset management in terms of knowledge? Do all they have a specific responsibility in the management of some assets? Arjan? Arjan?
Do they all have specific responsibility in the asset management? Yes, the attendees in the Living Lab, many of them had specific roles in asset management. I have to admit there was quite a lot of attendance of people more higher in the decision-making chain. For a next Living Lab, we would like to see more people involved on asset management on a day-to-day basis. It was very hard to compare if we both had similar responsibilities because, well, you need quite some talking to find out how roles are carved out on both sides of the border. So yes, did they have specific roles in terms of asset management? Yes, all were very much involved in asset management on both sides and all had their own responsibilities, but due to the big differences in institutions, it was very hard to compare. But reading the question again from Fabio, they have a specific responsibility in the management of some assets? There were not specific persons attending who had the responsibility for a specific asset or specific element in the corridor. But for instance, the director for all highways around Antwerp was there, so she had a big responsibility for all different elements and assets playing out in that region. And we also had the director at the Dutch side responsible for asset management in broader sense for the entire Rijkswaterstaat agency. So yes, there were quite some people with very specific roles in asset management, but mostly in the higher parts of the line of sight, so to speak.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that answers the question.
I think that you did. The next question is from Robert Jan Ruijfrog. How do results of the 3 different living labs flow into this framework that the AM4INFRA project is developing?
That's on the agenda for next week. Yeah. The first living lab played out in Rome. That was in Italian. So the results have been presented in a webinar, but it's good to have a face-to-face conversation as well about this, and it will be done next week. The results of this webinar will also be discussed in a smaller group of all people involved in the AM4INFRA project. And then also the Living Lab London will play out. And the Living Lab London next week is not only about the specific transportation problems playing out in that region, it's also about the wrap-up of all the living labs. So that discussion will be done next week. So far, what we've seen from Rome and Eindhoven, it fills a need where agencies see that they need to come together to align their programs to get maximum results from the assets, and there need to be a platform to do this and to have these conversations and meetings. Both living labs seem to fill that need. I can imagine that would be one of the conclusions, but we have to get back to that next week. I hope that, well, it's perhaps not entirely the answer of this question, but it's coming up. So keep listening, I would say.
Okay, thank you, Arjan. Are there more questions, either by voice or by this chat? Yeah, there's another question by Geraldine. Arjan, again for you. You're the core guy here. Based on your living lab in Eindhoven, do you foresee a need to amend the framework?
Yeah, great question. In fact, I do. Also discussing with some other people. Reflecting on the AM4INFRA framework architecture, what was most interesting to see, or most interesting, I kind of expected from our own organization that it's quite easy to pinpoint problems to specific steps in your own process or specific department or specific responsibilities. But the issues that played out in crossing the border tended to link to many of those elements in the framework. So that makes it a bit more difficult to tie it exactly to one element in the framework. So I'm well. This still needs some discussion. But for instance, the element of the truck parking was very interesting. This is not. This is something you have to look out for in terms of maintenance of those truck parkings, because they are heavily used. So that's a very operational thing. But it's also about expanding trucking parks, because we expect traffic flows to grow. But also a variety of other issues were related to this. Sometimes not even the responsibility of the owner organization, which asks for instance, policy actions. So immediately you see the truck parking problem is playing out all over the place in referring to the framework architecture. So that's something to consider and something to discuss, because the framework, well, intends to be helpful in stimulating the conversation, and for some of the topics, you see it touches on many parts. So the question is whether or not the framework is helpful for those kind of topics. So that's, I think, one of the major issues we have to discuss in terms of the adaptations or edits on the framework architecture. But I hope to come back to that next week.
Okay.
Are you still
Thank
here?
you.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I'm just answering in the chat. Some more questions? Well, if not, then there is the time to close this or to wrap up this session, this webinar. I thank you again, everyone, for participating to the webinar. Apologies for these problems at the beginning and during the webinar. There were some. For the next steps, I would like to remind you that there will be next week there will be another Living Lab. It will be in London on 8th and 9th of March, but there will be on 20th of March there will be the webinar presenting results of that Living Lab. After you've heard that there will be also the final seminar at the TRA conference in Vienna this year, in April this year. So another